Well, welcome to everyone watching us around the world. And let me just tell you that last night's session is already up online. You can view it if you missed it. And I think you missed an interesting session. You go to youtube.com/McGill and it is there. We'll remind you at the end. And again, tonight's session will be up running hopefully by tomorrow. So welcome to the second evening of the 2021 Trottier Public Science Symposium. And I think we have a neat session for you here today. So let's get into it right away. Oh, way back in the 1800s, it was Edgar Allan Poe who wondered about the difference between life and death. And of course, we have been wondering about that ever since. We can go back to the ancient Egyptians who thought that there was going to be life after death. We know this because they actually equipped the pyramids and other burial sites with food that the departed was to take along on their journey to the other world. And we are quite confident that this is true because we have drawings, paintings on walls which depict all of the food that was going to be given for that trip to the other world. Well, obviously, many religions also believe that there is life after death, especially in terms of what happens to what we now call the soul. I don't think too many religions believe that there's going to be a physical body after death, but the soul. And what is that? The French philosopher René Descartes thought about that, and he actually located the soul. It was supposed to be in that tiny little gland, almost smack in the middle of our skull, the pineal gland. He thought this was the seat of the soul. And then Dr. McDougall actually tried to weigh the soul. In this rather remarkable experiment back in 1906, he designed a special bed on which a person who was near death would be made to lie down. And he wanted to see whether or not there was any loss in weight when the soul departed the body. And he claimed that there was. This was written up in 1907 in a scientific paper. And I'm sure, as many of you know, the movie 21 Grams was based on that rather interesting experiment. Incidentally, it has never been repeated. Well, I don't think that Vladimir Demikov, a Soviet physiologist, cared very much about the soul. He did, however, investigate life and death. He wanted to know, believe it or not, if a head could live without the body. And he found, amazingly, that it could. Not in humans, but in dogs. This is not a doctored picture. This was a real experiment where he transplanted the head of a puppy onto a much, much larger dog. And for 9 days, both heads lived. The smaller head even drank. Rather remarkable. We didn't know much about this because in those days, the Soviets were very secretive. We only found out decades later. But this research inspired Dr. Robert White, a famous American neurosurgeon, to try his own brand of head transplants. And he focused on monkeys. He actually removed the head of a monkey and he put it on the head of another monkey. Obviously, the spinal cord was severed, so there was no movement below the neck. But amazingly, the head survived for days and even retained memory. We know that because the head tried to bite Dr. White's finger, remembering his tormentor. Dr. White even practiced transplanting heads on cadavers because he had an idea that this experiment could be done on humans. And he suggested that Dr. Hawking and Christopher Reeve, both of whom, of course, had terrible debilitating injuries, he suggested that they could have, as he called it, a body transplant, so that when their body gave up, the head could be placed on a healthy body and their magnificent brains could be kept alive. Sounds like science fiction, except in the world of Drs. Sergio Canavero and Ren Zhaoping. These surgeons believe that this is actually achievable. And they have done some experiments on animals where they have severed the spinal cord and replanted the head onto the same animal, and they said that they regained function. They even have a volunteer, a handicapped Russian, who says that he is willing to be the, quote, guinea pig in this experiment. Now, I have to point out that these are both respected neurosurgeons. They are not quacks. But this certainly conjures up images of Frankenstein. But they fight back, saying that they have the evidence, and they have published it, and they've got details about what they have been able to do in animals with restoring the spinal cord. Most of the scientific community, certainly the neurological community, looks on this askance, thinking that, no, this is a little bit far-fetched. But, you know, there have been far-fetched ideas before in science that eventually materialized. At first, nobody thought kidneys could be transplanted. No one thought hearts could be transplanted, but here we are. Anyway, for tonight, we will focus on heads that remain attached to the body. And we're going to first call on Dr. Lesley Fellows, who's a professor of medicine and vice dean of medicine here at McGill. And she is going to talk to us about the brain and how to keep it functioning well. And after Dr. Fellows has finished, I will return and will ask the question of whether or not we can communicate with the dearly departed. So I will now invite Dr. Fellows to share the screen and launch into a discussion on how to keep our brain active and healthy.
Thanks very much for that, those introductory remarks. I'm not sure I've ever had an introduction that went quite like that. It's a real pleasure to be here. I guess I should have titled my talk, How to Get Ahead. Is that, yeah. So I was going to talk about brain health from a variety of perspectives. I do think that having your head firmly attached to your body is probably a good start, but let's see where we can go from there. So first, I'm going to try to explain to you a little bit what I mean by brain health. And then I'm going to talk about the brain a little bit, about how it works in very general terms, and how that can help us think about what determines the health of our brains from moment to moment. And then I'm going to talk about brain health across the lifespan, and what are the factors that are important in keeping optimal brain function over the whole lifespan. And I'm going to bring in an idea that I hope you'll find interesting about the importance of social experience and societal considerations in brain health. So without further ado, let me dive in. So when we talk about brains and we want to sort of zoom in, we end up looking at a neuron, a brain cell, which is a pretty amazing cell. They come in different shapes and sizes, but the basic idea is they have many branches, ramifications, and thereby many connections. And they work by connecting and relaying information, and as ensembles and circuits, maintaining information. And that information includes representations of the world, internal representations of the world around us, and also representations of our thoughts and potential actions, and allowing us to steer our bodies to act. So that's a single neuron. It's an electrochemical machine. It has the capacity to maintain the electrical gradient and use that to trigger impulses, which in turn lead to neurochemical release, carrying the information across the connections between brain cells and building up into networks of cells that are capable of representing this kind of complex information. It's a pretty sophisticated cell. I'm endlessly impressed by neurons. And when they're acting together in interconnection, their abilities to represent information become even greater. And there are a lot of neurons in the brain. There's something like 100 billion. They're not all the same. They're connected in different ways. when we think about the whole brain, we've zoomed out further. Those neurons are now specialized in sort of different regions, similar electrochemical properties, but now talking to local neighbors about particular kinds of inputs and producing particular kinds of outputs, and then interacting across regions of the brain in large-scale networks that underlie everything from sleep and consciousness to very particular abilities like language and particular aspects of memory and learning, and so on. So if we start with individual neurons, we put them together in these increasingly complex networks, increasingly specialized networks, and we end up with the whole brain. But it's important to remember that this whole brain is nonetheless relying on the same fundamental electrochemical systems to allow a really dynamic representation of the world around us and our potential actions in it that are going to allow us to guide our behavior in ways that'll keep us alive and well, which is pretty remarkable. These are working at millisecond levels of resolution and in action constantly. The brain is constantly, in some sense, on. Even more remarkably, maybe, our brains are interacting with each other. So it's already impressive enough that we're able to use these little brain cells stuck together in networks to represent the world around us, thoughts and actions. It's even more impressive that we're able to interact with other organs like that another brain can interact with ours, that we can understand the messages that are being sent no longer across synapses, but now with language just across space, never mind across the internet, and that we can understand what the other person is telling us, appreciate their experiences and perspectives, and respond in, once again, a very dynamic and rapid way to what's going on around us. And it's perhaps underappreciated that a lot of real estate in the brain is dedicated to these social abilities. Humans are really social animals. Amongst our major evolutionary advantages is the capacity to work together. That actually takes a lot of brain real estate. And a lot of the brain functions that we have maybe studied in sort of more cognitive terms turn out to be very important, in fact, in the social world. The language being an obvious one, but many others as well. So if we're going to think about brain health, first I'm going to, I guess, say that when I use the term brain health, one of the reasons I like to use that term is that it captures the idea that there's both, if you want, a neurological aspect to brain health, those brain cells in good shape, interacting effectively together, but also mental health, and that you can't take mental health out of the brain, that mental health is a product of the brain, and experiences that alter mental health will alter the brain. So I think and mental health and cognitive health tightly interact. So I think it's a very powerful idea to kind of bring brain health, bring those things together, rather than thinking them as separate topics, one belonging to psychiatry and one to neurology. And let's put them together and understand the interplay between these concepts that indeed all arise in the brain, and that we're going to get more traction in a variety of senses by doing that. So that's one idea, that brain health is the whole bundle of, if you want, neurological, cognitive type of health and mental health together. And then the other idea is represented up here in the corner of this picture. This is a model that's commonly used to try to sort of scientifically approach chronic or health conditions. And the reason I put it up here is to kind of cause us all to think in slightly wider scale about what might be contributing to brain health. This is called the Wilson-Cleary model. It's an example of models that are commonly used to try to understand the experience of people with health conditions. And the important points here are that, yes, there's a biology at the basis of health, and those nerve cells, for example. But then there's a series of stages that takes us from these basic biological mechanisms all the way up to fully engaged, meaningful life, quality of life, like the highest levels of human flourishing, and the steps in between where people might have symptoms or concerns or experiences. Those things might have an impact or not on their ability to function. their perception of their own abilities and their own health, and then finally their full kind of quality of life. So those stages are important to keep in mind, or those interrelationships, because each of those steps is a potential place for intervention, if you want. That for a given biological state, different people might have different outcomes on their quality of life, depending on the next steps in this sort of ladder. The other thing that I think is very important to keep in mind is that all of these stages are influenced by characteristics of the individual. The person affected, differences in a variety of factors are going to potentially contribute. And maybe as a very simple example, Christopher Reeve, shown in the introduction, the fact that he had access to excellent medical care and a very fancy looking wheelchair expands his functional capacities compared to someone who might not have the resources to overcome some of their disability using other tools and mechanisms, just as a very simple example. The other thing to keep in mind is that all of these levels are influenced by characteristics of the environment. And I mean that in a really broad sense, the world around the person. So this sort of holistic approach is thing I'm going to draw on here to talk about brain health. And as I mentioned, one reason for wanting to think about that is it provides a broader view on the factors that are important in brain health. And it also provides potentially multiple mechanisms of intervention. And even if we do not have the capacity to intervene on biological levels, which we may or may not, that there are still levels of intervention where there's a lot of capacity to intervene. So I'm a very optimistic person talking about brain health. The brain is complicated. We're still understanding a lot of what's going on in the brain under normal conditions and under pathological conditions. But there are levels of intervention in even the most challenging biological situation where we can improve the lives of people with brain health issues. So I'm just going to run through some principles of brain function. So as I mentioned earlier on, the brain is obviously a physical organ. It's really metabolically active. It has to pump like crazy to keep the electrical gradients it needs to be able to respond instantly when it's called upon to carry a signal. It has to hold itself in readiness. Every neuron has to hold itself in readiness, and every ensemble of neurons has to optimize how it's prepared to respond. And to do that requires a lot of energy. So there's a lot of energy requirement. There's a lot of ongoing maintenance just to be prepared to do something. And then there's the events that are carried in terms of electrical signals that occur with split-second timing, and that are carried in both electrical and chemical forms, interactions at the level of inside the cell, second messengers, interactions between cells with receptors, chemicals binding to receptors. So there's a lot going on at the molecular and cellular level. Those are like local connections. There's long-term connections, and there's also sort of large-scale modulation of brain states that are carried also by other kinds of chemicals, neurochemicals and neuromodulators. And the brain is also influenced by the hormonal state of the body. Many of the circulating factors in the rest of the body can indeed influence brain function. So there's a lot going on from electrical and chemical perspectives locally at sort of moderate scales in the brain, and in terms of the whole body's influence on the brain. This is kind of illustrated by this number. So if you weigh a brain, it weighs about around 1.5 kilos, roughly, depending on the person. So as a percentage of body weight, that's maybe 2%. But if you ask how much blood flow does the brain take, it takes 20% of the blood flow. So there's about 5 liters a minute of blood flowing around you, and one of those liters goes straight to the brain, even though it's actually quite small compared to the rest of you. And that reflects its hugely energy demanding characteristics. It also can't wait long without blood. So if you're going to transplant a head, don't wait a long time. You're going to have to plug those blood vessels back in a hurry if you want the brain to live. The reason for bringing this up is that I wanted to kind of turn our attention to another somewhat neglected until recently aspect of brain at the cellular level. So I showed you the neuron. The neuron's kind of the star of the show in the traditional story about the brain. But in fact, the neuron is sort of like a prima donna from my point of view. First of all, it has a lot of help. There's these hardworking astrocytes, these blue cells in this picture, that are very important in maintaining the capacity of the neurons to do what they need to do. Sort of like the pit crew for neurons, I suppose. And then just as importantly, maybe more importantly, the astrocytes connect closely with the small blood vessels in the brain, shown here in the pink part, cut and cross section, showing you a capillary or a small arteriole. And there's a close electrical interaction between the astrocytes, the neurons, and these small blood vessels that form a kind of functional unit, sometimes called the neurovascular unit. And our understanding about this has really changed over the last while. And it helps us to understand that local brain activity, local electrical impulses, which require a lot of energy to recover from, lead actually immediately to local changes in the blood vessel reactivity to bring more blood, in fact, even more than we need, locally. So the blood vessels are kind of part of the information unit in the brain, and their health is therefore very important to the brain's health overall. So when we think about brain health, it's actually very useful to think about vascular health as well. There's a few more points here about the brain. So the brain is in the body. I mentioned that circulating factors, for example, hormones, glucose levels, oxygen levels, and so on, can directly influence brain function, often in very extreme ways, at the extremes. I mentioned that the mind is in the brain, which is a reason to think about mental health types of symptoms and cognitive and other brain function symptoms together in one group, because it lets us understand the interplay across these things. There's a few more points about the brain that are going to be important for us thinking about optimizing brain function. The brain is pretty amazing what it can do, but it's actually at the outer edge of its capacity a lot of the time. It has a pretty limited capacity. It's got a lot of workarounds to address this, but nonetheless, it's working kind of at the outer edge of its ability much of the time. It also has a very narrow window for optimal performance, so any little thing can push the brain off its game. And the last point about the brain is that it monitors itself. So if we're wondering how we're doing, how's my brain doing? You have to ask your own brain, how are you doing? It's maybe not the most reliable source. The brain can fool itself. It often fools itself. It thinks we think we do better than we actually do. And there's plenty of visual illusions and other things like that online to show you how little you're actually appreciating about what's going on around you. You know that for yourself if you're sitting and reading something you find fascinating, person talking to you, you may not even notice that they're talking, and then you look up and say, did you say something? When you focus your attention on one thing, you're really leaving all the rest aside. Your brain's not processing it really. And that kind of thing is going on all the time. But we're not necessarily aware of it. We kind of fill in and fudge and think we have a rough idea of what's happening where we may not. The other thing about the brain monitoring itself is when it does monitor itself, it's using brain power. So the more you're monitoring, the less you have available to actually carry out tasks, which can be a problem if people are worrying about their brain function. They may be distracted by their own monitoring. So I want to talk about what are the hardest things the brain does, because that's going to help us understand what are the characteristics, the symptoms that people experience if their brain's not working quite right. So here's a bit of a list, not exhaustive, of the hard things the brain does. I mentioned some of these already. Selective attention is definitely one of the hardest things the brain does. It does that to make best use of the limited capacity it's got. It's got mechanisms to focus on what really matters. And that means putting the brain power available on a pretty narrow set of information. At any given time, we're taking our best guess about what's important. And doing that despite being distracted. Protecting our selective spotlight of attention from distractions, quite a demanding task for the brain and very important for our cognitive success. I mentioned that the brain is monitoring its performance. That also is quite a hard thing to do. Departing from routines, that's hard. That's why the brain actually tries quite hard to turn as much as it can into routine. The more we can turn our behaviors into automatic routines, the less brain power we need to spend on them. So that's good, and it's adaptive to a point. But if you're trying to overcome a routine, that's demanding. You have to suppress the automatic response and do something new. And that together is a very challenging task, especially to do reliably. And typically, as soon as you get distracted or tired, you'll fall back into the routine response. Communicating, obviously, that's tough, especially through multiple levels of media here, as this evening across screens, but even in person. Communication, sending and receiving, is an advanced brain function. Likewise, social interactions beyond communication, understanding nonverbal cues, anticipating what people might or might not respond in a certain context or situation. That's hard work. That's dynamic. It's unpredictable. There's even more degrees of freedom about how things might go. So that's hard brain work. Similarly, empathy, being able not only to see the world from your own perspective, but to imagine the world from someone else's perspective, is really advanced. And then to think ahead, outside the local environment, the local moment, further into time, potentially across days, weeks, months, or years, and to maintain behaviors that reach a very distant, unseen goal, is a very advanced brain ability. So if the brain's not in tip-top shape, then you see actually a pretty similar picture, no matter what the reason is for the brain not being exactly on its game. A whole variety of conditions, whether they're health medical conditions, sleep deprivation, side effects of medications, extreme stress, you name it, leads to a similar phenotype of what I think of as sort of mild brain failure, temporary states generally, but they all look about the same regardless of the cause. And that is because the hardest brain functions are failing. So the person is distractible. They're not productive. They can't get a task done. They keep getting off task. They may forget information that's given to them in the moment. They're rigid and they fall back on old habits. Why did I walk into this room? I can't remember why I came here. It was an automatic habit that you followed while you were distracted. Trouble finding words. Coming up with the right word at normal cadences of speech is actually really hard. We're pulling from potentially thousands of words. We're doing it really, really fast. It's a wonder we do it so well. And if the brain's not working right, people tend to stumble or hesitate, especially over less frequent words or proper names. Also missing subtle signals from other, misinterpreting subtle social cues. And perhaps relatedly, being more irritable or cranky, not being able to manage emotional responses appropriately. That requires quite a lot of control. And if your brain's not working well, that can kind of slip. Sort of, again, relatedly, more of a self-focus, more concern over own perspective, less for other perspectives, and narrowing of interests and goals to short-term immediate needs. So if a brain's not working perfectly, it tends to be some version of this pattern that people experience. So if we're asking ourselves, well, how can we help our brains be at their best? One is just to sort of understand what are the hard things the brain has to do, and how can we help? How can we help? How can we provide good working conditions for our brain? Of course, you got to keep it fed and watered. Exercise, for a variety of reasons, is really good for the brain in the moment. Getting some rest from a cognitive point of view, you can't always be on at the top of your game. You need to take breaks from one sort of task and do something else. Sleep is important to brain health. Psychoactive substances are made to alter brain function, and perhaps that's a desired outcome depending on why you're exposing yourself to one. But chronically or even acutely, of course, it changes brain function. And that may be a problem in the medium term, depending. So you have to be careful. And a lot of people are exposed to psychoactive substances without realizing it, in the sense that medications they may take for other conditions, other health conditions, may have side effects that include effects on the brain. And then prioritize, use your brain where it counts. We can't imagine that we're going to focus on a million things at once, one thing at a time, and do the important things first. One of the principles about the brain function that's worth mentioning is this inverted U shape. That is a very common pattern of relationship between some brain variable or other and performance. For example, in this case, arousal. So if you're not very alert, your performance is going to be low. And as your alertness or arousal goes up, your performance will come up. But it doesn't just keep rising. If you push arousal further and further, you actually come over the top of the inverted U and your performance will start to fail. You're sort of hyper aware, hyperactive, hyper whatever, and performance drops. It's because the brain is this complex biological system that this relationship tends to take this shape. And one of the issues is that if you're performing about here, which is less than where you wanted to be performing, you could push yourself harder. And in this case, you would do better. But you could be performing at the same place and actually be over here on this limb of the inverted U and not realize it. And if you push yourself harder, you're going to get worse. You actually should ease off to do better. So understanding that there may be situations where easing off might actually help you perform better can be really useful. If you're driving harder and harder and you're getting worse and worse, ease off. You might find that your performance comes up to this sort of sweet spot of brain function. Stress is a common experience. And one of the things to keep in mind, because stress has a lot of effects on the brain. But that's mostly because some degree of stress is good for optimizing performance under sort of urgent situations, important situations. The problem is when stress becomes maladaptive. So you can think of it as kind of the variation between a challenge, which might push the brain for the better, and a stress, which may lead to maladaptive responses. That depends, of course, on the severity and diversiveness of whatever's going on, but also on the controllability. A very important aspect of stress is whether you think you can control any aspect of it. If you can, even if it's the illusion of control, it will lower your stress. Social evaluation plays into stress. That's why public speaking is so stressful. And there are multiple mechanisms for coping with stress that can directly have impacts on the biological stress response, including the response in the brain, both personal coping and social support related coping. So let me say something about brain health. So we talked about sort of brain health in the moment. There's lots of factors that can push brain health off. But what about brain health across the lifespan? There's some pretty obvious stuff that I think most people already know, whether they practice it or not. There's pretty good evidence that healthy living in middle age protects against cognitive decline later in life. And what does that mean? Things like keeping a healthy body weight. There's some evidence that maybe specifically Mediterranean diet or similar vegetable forward diets are particularly useful. There's some who vote for oily fish. There's a few ideas out there about diet, but the point is that healthy body weight is a major factor. Unfortunately, limiting alcohol is probably important. Regular physical activity, and I put my little blood cell or my blood vessel back up here to remind us that a bunch of steps that can be taken in midlife or younger to protect brain health across the lifespan actually probably relate to keeping the vascular system healthy, because the vascular system is crucial to this metabolically demanding brain. So regular exercise, blood pressure control, diabetes and lipid control, and not smoking. Those are the things that are going to actually have big impacts on the brain. Those are biological variables, and there's something you can do something about as a prevention at any age. Maybe less obvious, but also as or even more important, depending on the variable. Social factors. So now we're talking about characteristics of the individual and characteristics of the environment that influence brain health substantially. Higher education, going to public lectures in the evening, well known to be good for brain health. Economic sufficiency, physical security, higher social status, strong social networks, meaningful work or meaningful hobbies, volunteer work, and wider experience, travel, and other opportunities like that. Those are all factors that are thought to contribute to resilience of brain health across the lifespan. And many of those factors are not necessarily directly controlled by the individual, but rather substantially relate to their position in society and their environment. As one quick example of the impact of these kinds of social variables, this is from work we've been doing in older people living with HIV and the Positive Brain Health Now study. That's a Canadian study looking at factors that influence brain health in older people living with well-controlled HIV. And we focused in this study on loneliness. And there are a number of factors in these chronically ill people that contribute to loneliness. They're social factors, mostly poverty and stigma, isolation, physical factors like reduced mobility. And the impacts of that are substantial on the brain. They affect mood, of course, the effects of loneliness on mood, stress, but also cognition. Cognitive impairment is more likely to be present in those who report feeling more lonely. Just as an illustration of that, people who said they were almost never lonely across 6 different sort of domains of function do well, where 100 is best. Whereas people who say they're often lonely are substantially worse off across all these domains, of course, social, but also psychological and even physical health. So I'll just say a couple of words about neuroplasticity. People usually want to know if they can train their brains to protect brain health. So neuroplasticity is just a fancy word for learning. If you learn something new, your brain changed. That's how the brain learns. It changes. The brain is a machine for prediction. Its main job is to try to predict what's going to happen next. And the reason for that is, once again, because the brain is trying to preserve its processing for the most important things. And the most important things are those that are unexpected. So you need to know what you're predicting in order to know whether it happened or not. So the brain is predicting. I thought I should include a chemistry reference here. It's the element of surprise that interests the brain. It's the mismatch between what the brain predicted would happen and what actually happened that drives learning. This is a general mechanism in the brain. If your prediction is perfect and there's no surprise, what happens is what you expected. There's no need to make any changes to the brain. You've learned the thing already and you're done. The brain is good. The brain's ready for the next time something like this comes up. It'll predict what happens and you'll be ready for it. No learning needed. So perfection is actually the enemy of neuroplasticity. If you're interested in the brain constantly changing and reforming itself, you need to put yourself in situations where you experience surprise. That is, you experience outcomes that you're not expecting, you make errors and need to adjust. That's what drives neuroplasticity. And one more plug for kind of a different perspective on brain function. So people often think about this kind of thing when they're thinking about like training their brain. Let's do some hard math or tough problems, get out the Sudoku book and see what we can do. And those things do demand brain exercise, no doubt about it. But I guess I'm going to argue that these kinds of situations that are much, much more powerful in terms of driving neuroplasticity is interacting with other people, especially in a meaningful or positive setting where you're going to get reward signals, motivationally important signals, dynamic interplay, unexpected surprises. This is the kind of circumstance that's really going to engage a lot of the brain in ways likely to drive neuroplasticity. So if you're looking to train your brain, it's interacting with people. That is a strong way to do it. So I'm just going to end with these last thoughts here, that no brain is an island. A lot of the aspects of brain health are socially determined. I showed you briefly that there can be major impacts of things like loneliness, marginalization, stigmatization, and inequity on cognition as well as on mental health through a whole variety of mechanisms across that kind of holistic model I showed you. I argued that social experience drives neuroplasticity for the better if the social experiences are positive, and for the worse if people are isolated, abandoned, neglected, as to some degree we've all experienced in the last while. So positive social experiences associated with better cognition, better mental health, lower risk for dementia, and ongoing learning at any age. I'm just going to end by thanking some of the people who've been especially influential in my thinking around these things, and the funding agencies that have helped with some of this research. Thanks.
Well, thanks very much. Great insight into the brain. And I didn't think that there would be the connection that I'm going to forge now, but there is, because you just finished mentioning how important it is to connect with others. And what about connecting with people who are no longer with us, which is exactly what I'm going to talk about. Well, we have seen the movie Many, many different versions of the same theme. But of course, here we are talking fiction. There are people, however, who believe that they have seen the real entity, that ghosts really do exist. This is not a minority of the population. When we take a look at statistics, amazingly, 58% of the public believes in hauntings, in the presence of ghosts, in an afterlife. So we're talking about more than half the population. These beliefs, of course, are in no way new. We can go back to the biblical era, take a look at the book of Samuel, and extract from it. When the woman saw Samuel, she cried out at the top of her voice and said, "Saul, why have you deceived me? You are Saul." The king said to her, "Don't be afraid. What do you see?" The woman said, "I see a ghostly figure coming out of the earth." Yes, a ghost appeared, as in this famous painting by William Blake. So there certainly is mention of ghosts in the Bible. In the Middle Ages, Macbeth, one of the classic Shakespeare plays, you'll remember the ghost of Banquo appears to Macbeth. And in Hamlet, he sees the ghost of his father. Later on, in the late 18th and early 19th century, when Franz Anton Mesmer introduced the notion that we now refer to as mesmerism, I think we can call it hypnotism, whereby the mind kind of takes over the work of the body. Hypnosis is a fascinating phenomenon. And of course, we talk a great deal about the connection between the body and the mind. Well, there were claims by people who underwent mesmerism or hypnosis that while they were in this so-called trance, they saw ghosts, they saw spirits that they described very vividly. However, the real era of ghostly apparitions, what we refer to as spiritualism, dates back to 1848 and the fascinating experience that public had with Kate and Maggie Fox, the two sisters. And it all happened in this house right here, which now has been maintained as a historic relic, because spiritualism, very interesting facet of history. It all started when the girls were very young, and they called in a neighbor and told her that they heard strange noises in the house, which they thought were spirits. And these were rappings, just knocks like that. But the knocks would answer questions. There would be a set number of knocks for a yes, another number of knocks for a no. People would come and ask questions, and they would hear these knocks. And the girls said that they had somehow made contact with the spirit world, that they were talking to the dead. The Fox sisters became amazingly famous, traveled around the country, rapping, and people were absolutely amazed that their questions were being answered from what they thought was the spirit world. Well, later on, as they matured, they got older, Margaret Fox admitted how they had faked it. She demonstrated how they had learned to crack the knuckles of their toes to make the rapping sounds. They showed how they used their own hair to produce psychokinetic phenomena, whereby objects seem to move by themselves. But interesting enough, not everyone believed it. They said that for some reason, she was faking the fake and that it was all real. When the Civil War came around, so did the ghosts. And this happens whenever there's a great loss of life. People want to contact the departed. So there were all kinds of ghost stories that emerged during the Civil War, and people made all kinds of efforts to contact the dead. So spiritualists, mediums, were very, very popular at that time. Also, photography had just been introduced, and this led to what has been called spirit photography. And here's a classic example. Mumler was one of the most famous of the spirit photographers. And as you can see in this photograph here, Abraham Lincoln, after he had died, communicating with his wife from the spirit world. Today, of course, we have learned not only to be careful with everything that we hear, but also to be careful with everything that we see. And this, of course, is now underlined by the presence of Photoshop and all the CGI, all the wonderful things that we can do to trick people. Photography no longer means anything because you can make a picture show anything that you wanted. But in those days, this was very believable. People didn't know about double exposures. Houdini, who of course was a great scourge of the spiritualists, and we will talk about him later, showed how easy it was to fake these kind of photographs. Here is Houdini conversing with Abraham Lincoln, which of course would have been an impossibility, but it looks like perfectly acceptable picture. Soon after the Fox sisters, the Davenport brothers appeared on the scene with their own brand of spiritual phenomena. They introduced the spirit cabinet. They would climb into this cabinet. They would allow members of an audience to tie them up, and then the doors would close, and the musical instruments that had been placed inside of the cabinet would play. Supposedly, the spirits were very musically inclined. And when the doors were opened, the instruments were back in their place, apparently not having been reached by the brothers, and they were still firmly tied up. They made a real go of this. They traveled not only around the US, but also across Europe, demonstrating their spirit orchestra. As you can expect, magicians are very upset when effects that they have developed on the stage for entertainment purposes are used by people who claim that these phenomena are supernatural or paranormal. And the Davenport brothers were unmasked by several magicians. John Neville Maskelyne was a main one because he was a world famous magician at that time. And he showed how you can duplicate the efforts of the Davenport brothers, how easy it is to get out of the ties, how they had control over the way that the audience members would tie their hands. And he duplicated all the phenomena. He was not the only one. Here's another one where Professor Anderson, also a very well-known magician at the time, as you can see, the Davenport brothers were annihilated, according to him. Well, no, they were not annihilated. They made a very, very good living because people want to believe such things. Michael Faraday was not one of those people. Michael Faraday, one of the greatest scientists who ever lived, and a tremendous champion of critical thinking. He, of course, was the discoverer of a number of elements. He developed electrolysis. He was fundamental in developing the electrical engine, absolutely a brilliant man. But he was very concerned how the world had become so credulous and superstitious, and that they believed in absolutely ridiculous things. And he lectured about this. So you can understand why Michael Faraday is really one of my heroes. And a visit to the Royal Institution in England is basically a holy experience, because this is where Faraday and Humphrey Davy and numerous others lectured to the public about the benefits of science and about the importance of critical thinking and making sure that your brain functions in a proper fashion. This was a challenging job at that time because the world was very taken by spiritual phenomena. Seances were extremely popular. It was a major form of entertainment, although they didn't really see it as entertainment because they believed it was real. One of the most famous mediums at that time was Eusapia Palladino, an Italian lady, whose specialty was levitating tables during a seance. So the customers would sit around, have their hands on the table, and all of a sudden the table would tilt and at least one leg would lift off the ground. She had developed the technique of being able to nudge that table with her foot. She always wore these long skirts. And it's quite amazing that people were taken in by this. Now, you would think that it was only unsophisticated people who would be taken in by such very simple tricks. No. Marie and Pierre Curie were certainly not unsophisticated scientists. They were brilliant people. But they investigated Palladino. They thought that she had some sort of talent. Marie wasn't all that convinced, but Pierre swallowed it whole hog. He believed that she was really able to conjure up spirits and that it was the spirits that were allowing the table to be lifted. Now, they, of course, had worked on radioactivity, which was an invisible force. So it was not unusual for them to try to investigate these unusual forces. But it's quite amazing that Pierre Curie, a noted scientist, gave credence to the fact that spirits could materialize and lift a table. Not the only scientist who was taken in. Sir William Crookes, very, very well known. He was a chemist. He was the discoverer of the element thallium. He made the classic Crookes tube, which was the forerunner of the vacuum tube. So he was no slouch in the scientific world. But scientists at that time, including Michael Faraday, including the Curies, including Crookes, were keen to investigate mediums because had they found that this was legitimate, that would have been a huge advance in the world of science. His main subject for investigation was the spirit medium by the name of Florence Cook. And Florence Cook claimed that she would go into a trance and her body would transform into a spirit, into her spirit guide, and that her body could still be visible while the spirit materialized. Pretty interesting claim. Well, Crookes took it all in. Not only that, he even had himself photographed with this spirit that had materialized. Not bothered by the fact that the spirit looked to be very much flesh and blood, and that the spirit, whose name was Katie King, had a striking resemblance to Florence Cook. But he actually believed that he was witnessing the materialization of a spirit. Crookes became one of the founding members of the Society for Psychical Research, which still exists today. They are still studying such phenomena, never having found any kind of evidence for it. But how did someone like Crookes come to believe in the spirit world? It probably was something that we now call pathological science. Irving Langmuir, known Nobel Prize winning chemist, put it together very well, is that when someone wants to see something so badly, the wishful thinking will make it happen, and they will not be convinced that it all was generated from their own mind. One of the classic examples was Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. Certainly could not be called an unintelligent man. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, of course, was the creator of Sherlock Holmes, the most scientific of all detectives. And yet, the creator believed in spirits. Absolutely fascinating, because if you're familiar with the Sherlock Holmes stories, and if you're not, you should be, it is so bizarre that someone who thinks so logically as Sherlock Holmes would have been created by someone who believed in spirits. Not only in spirits, Conan Doyle also believed in fairies. In 1917, this great man, a physician, was taken in by this rather clever photograph. He believed that this was real, that two little girls had actually taken pictures of themselves cavorting in the forest with fairies. Turned out, of course, that these were just cutouts from a catalog that they had strung up with thin threads and taken a picture. But Conan Doyle could not be convinced that he had been taken in because he had a tremendous ego. And he just would not believe that two uneducated little girls would be able to fool a man of his stature. One of the most interesting friendships of all time was the one between Conan Doyle and Harry Houdini. Houdini, of course, was the epitome of critical thinker, a scourge of the mediums, scientist at heart. They were friendly, even though, of course, they could not agree on the spirit world. And Conan Doyle actually believed that Houdini had paranormal powers. He was just hiding it because he could not believe how Houdini could carry out some of the escapes that he did, how he could walk through walls, which he did, if he did not have paranormal powers. Of course, Houdini could not reveal how he carried out his illusions. So he was stuck with Conan Doyle believing that he actually had paranormal powers and he not being able to prove that he didn't, because that would have meant giving away how he carried out his effects. But they carried on this interesting friendship. Here's a picture of the Conan Doyle family with Houdini in Atlantic City, where Madame Conan Doyle, who fancied herself being a medium, did a seance wanting to contact Houdini's mother. As you may know, Houdini was very, very close to his mother. And Mrs. Conan Doyle, shown here, said that she would be able to contact his departed mother. And so the seance started. And all of a sudden, Madame Doyle announced that she had made contact. And she started scribbling on a piece of paper the message. And it started out by her putting the symbol of a cross. This right away alerted Houdini that something was going awry here. His mother was Jewish. She was the wife of a rabbi, and she would have never signaled with the sign of a cross. And also when Madame Doyle began to transmit messages from Mrs. Weiss, Houdini's name was Eric Weiss, it was in perfect English. And Mrs. Weiss had never learned English. Her mother tongue was Yiddish, and that's the only way that she ever spoke. So unless there was an excellent Berlitz school of language in the other world, this communication was fraudulent. And Houdini and Conan Doyle had a big falling out over this. And then Houdini went deeper and deeper into exposing these fake mediums, although I would think that the word fake is redundant. And he wrote a number of books on how they carried out their tricks. And it was in one of these books that he made the classic statement that has been much repeated, often by myself, that anyone can talk to the dead, but the trouble is, they don't talk back. Houdini was absolutely committed to unmasking these mediums, not because he was against belief in spirit world, not at all. He had nothing against people who had legitimate beliefs. He himself even wondered whether or not there really could be a spirit world. What he was against were the fraudulent mediums who were using various kind of tricks to convince the gullible that they had contacted the other world. He even got two congressmen to set up a committee to investigate fortune telling. And in 1926, he got two congressmen to draft a bill that would have altered a law in DC, Washington, and it would have made it illegal to practice fortune telling and seances. As you might imagine, the mediums and the spiritualists were up in arms over this. But Houdini demonstrated in Congress how some of the tricks were carried out. how these horns would be made to float through the air to signal the presence of the spirits. He showed how mediums were able to take their feet out of their shoes and ring the spirit bell, which seemed impossible to the person sitting in the opposite chair here, who thought that he had his feet firmly planted on Houdini's feet. Well, he had them firmly planted on his shoes, but not necessarily on his feet. Also called to testify in that 1926 congressional hearing was Rose Mackenberg. And what a fascinating lady she was. She has since been termed as Houdini's girl detective. She started out her career as a private eye, as a detective working for a detective company, where a customer thought that he had been defrauded by a medium, and she was asked to look into this and found the fraud. And Houdini heard about this, and he interviewed her and hired her as one of his detectives. Houdini had a number of detectives in his quest to battle all of these fake mediums. And some of these detectives would go ahead of his performance cities into those cities and investigate mediums there, so that when Houdini came to perform, he could unmask those mediums on stage. And Rose Mackenberg was one of the ladies that he had hired. And she would get dressed up in disguise and visit different mediums, experience seances, transmit the information to Houdini, who then, during his performances on stage, would talk about them, would describe what had been seen in the people's cities. And so it happened in Montreal. When he came in 1926 to the Princess Theater, just 6 months after that investigation in Washington, after the congressional hearing, and he performed here at the Princess Theater. The theater no longer exists. The building exists, but it's no longer a theater. And it was there that he performed. And here is a little clip from the performance. And the third act of the performance was this one. After he had done his escapes, after he had performed illusions, the third act was Do the Dead Come Back? And this is where he talked about spiritualists, and he demonstrated the tricks that they performed. Well, unfortunately, it was in Montreal that the end began. It was here that he got that famous punch in the stomach, which led to his death a few days later on October 31st, the most appropriate day for a magician on which to die. And it was a McGill student, actually, who was involved in this. Houdini would give lectures in cities about mediums, about fake fortune tellers, etc., and about the importance of critical thinking. He would certainly be one who exercised his mind extremely well, and he wanted his audiences to do the same. He lectured in Montreal to McGill students at the Student Union, and this was a student union in those days. Today, of course, it has been turned into the museum, which is just across the street from the Automass Chemistry building where I am right now. So every time I look out, I imagine Houdini in there lecturing to McGill students. And I've always wanted to have them at least have some kind of a plaque there to remember that occasion. Anyway, one of the students did a portrait of Houdini while he was lecturing here, and he gifted him that. And Houdini asked him to come to the theater the next day to do a more formal portrait. And while he was doing that, and Houdini was answering some fan mail, a McGill student came in by the name of Whitehead, who was returning a book that he had borrowed. And in this book, Houdini had described how he was able to toughen up his stomach and withstand any blow to the stomach. And Whitehead asked him, is this true? And Houdini wasn't paying attention. He kind of grunted yes, which Whitehead took to mean, okay, go ahead. And he punched him in the stomach. Houdini, of course, had no time to prepare. He was hurt, but he would not let on. He was too proud, of course. He still performed that night in Montreal, including the classic Chinese water torture escape. They then went on to Detroit by train. He was very sick. He had a high fever. He was developing peritonitis. He performed one night in Detroit. He couldn't do the next night. He was taken to hospital. He died 3 days later on October 31st. Now, of course, the question comes up, Houdini, the man who was able to pull off every possible escape, would he be able to escape from the grave? After all, he had shown he could escape from handcuffs. He could escape from chains. And Bess, his wife, said that she would give it a try because they had agreed that if ever anyone was able to escape the Grim Reaper, it would be Houdini. And they had agreed on a certain set of words, and that if she heard those words from medium, she would know that contact had been made. And Bess Houdini organized seances for 10 years, every year, October 31st, hoping to hear from Harry. She never did. And 10 years after his death in 1936, she said, 10 years is enough to wait for any man. And she stopped the seances. I think Houdini would be rolling over in his grave if he saw what is going on today about psychics who claim to be able to speak to the dead. This is a very lucrative undertaking these days. James Van Praagh lives in a $3 million house. Psychic medium John Edward performs on stage to packed houses who pay hundreds of dollars for a seat. He is constantly on TV. The psychic on the couch, well, I'll agree, he and the people listening to him should be on a couch, but not that one. He has appeared with Dr. Oz. And of course, there's no greater fame than appearing with Dr. Oz. Although I would say infame is the more appropriate word. And John Edward, who talks to the dead, also makes a lot of money. His mansion is worth $5.5 million. To me, this is criminal behavior because these people are taking advantage of people at some of the most desperate parts of their life when they have just lost someone. And when they claim that they have contacted the dead, they are just making things worse for these people who then are not allowed to just contend with the fact that their loved one has departed and all they should live with is the memory. This is, to me, a criminal activity. Then we have the medical medium, Anthony William, who actually has a radio show where he gives medical advice, and he gets away with the medical advice because he says he's not the one who's really giving it. He has contact with spirits, and he's getting the advice from the spirit world, and he transmits this to the public. Interestingly enough, the usual advice given by the spirit is to drink celery juice. Seems to be a cure for everything. So we've seen that there certainly are all kinds of allusions to spirits and to ghosts. Do they really exist? Can you see them? Yes, you can. But you have to go to the haunted house in Disney World or in Disneyland. And you can actually see ghosts dancing through a very interesting scientific phenomenon. This is known as Pepper's ghost, and the illusion was invented by Dr. Pepper, not the Dr. Pepper of soft drink fame, back in the 1800s. And it's a wonderful illusion, as you can see here. There's a glass that is tilted at 45-degree angle towards the audience, and the light is shined on an actor below the stage. The reflection in the glass to the audience looks as if that actor is cavorting with the ones on the stage. In Disneyland, you ride in this buggy called the Doom Buggy through the exhibit, and you see the dancers, they're mechanical dancers, but you can see that they are dancing back here, but their reflection in the eyes of the people sitting here makes it appear as if they were looking at a ghost through the glass. Very interesting phenomenon. Now, of course, just because ghosts can be produced by this scientific means doesn't mean that there cannot be real ghosts. After all, there are people who say that they've seen them, that they've had these so-called near-death experiences where they see light at the end of a tunnel and they're moving toward that light and they're seeing their relatives beckoning to them. Now, these near-death experiences are real. There are people whose heart has stopped and whose brain waves have stopped momentarily and then have restarted. This can happen undergoing surgery, and people describe how they actually have left their body in a ghostly fashion and look down on their body. And sometimes they give details which are really quite fascinating, where they supposedly have described happenings in the operating room or the placement of objects that they couldn't possibly have seen from where they were lying. Of course, this has never been properly experimentally reproduced, but it is a fascinating phenomenon because it's not so rare. There are thousands and thousands of such cases that have been reported. But I think eventually there will be a scientific explanation found. Perhaps momentary lack of oxygen in one particular part of the brain creates such an illusion. I don't know. But just because there's something mysterious and not explained doesn't mean that we have to resort to paranormal explanations. So I will leave you with a quote from my favorite character, Sherlock Holmes. In The Adventure of the Sussex Vampire, when there's the possibility of a vampire being real, which of course Holmes does not believe, says, but are we going to give serious attention to such things? This agency stands flat-footed upon the ground, and there it must remain. The world is big enough for us. No ghost need apply. So I hope that we've given you an interesting little glimpse into the workings of the brain in many, many different ways today. And yesterday, different ideas about life and death. And if you have questions, we are going to entertain them. Please put them into the chat, and we'll try to answer as many as possible. And also, let me just remind you that we do have a website, and we have thousands of articles there, which are interesting, which will certainly help you with critical thinking, give you some brain exercise. You can also sign up for our free weekly newsletter that will appear every Saturday morning in your inbox. And we will also give you the links to yesterday's evening and to today's talks as well. Okay, well, let's see whether or not we can trigger some questions on the subjects that we have addressed. Let me start off by asking Lesley a question, because you were talking about empathy, which obviously is tremendously important when it comes to practicing medicine. Do you think that it is possible that there's some location in the brain where empathy is centered and where some people may have more activity than others?
That's actually been an area of quite a bit of research. The first challenge with that kind of research is defining exactly what you mean. So there are clearly brain systems that are the same brain systems that would be involved if you were to have a specific experience tend to also be involved if someone close to you is having that experience. So you're sort of mimicking it with the same neural representations. And then there's some additional brain real estate that's thought to be important in kind of you taking the other's perspective, being able to know what someone else must know, given what you know about what they know. These things are called theory of mind, and these sort of perspective taking have been actually an area of a lot of study. For one thing, they tend to be impaired in people with autism spectrum disorder. So for that reason, it's sort of clinically important to try to understand. So yes, part of the circuitry is the same as the circuitry that you would have active if you were going through an experience. And part of it is special, it seems, to taking the other's perspective. And it is, of course, a creative exercise, empathy. We can't really take their perspective. So it probably has.
The anatomy of the brain has been analyzed, ad nauseum. For example, Einstein's brain has been thinly sliced, right? And it's been analyzed to see if there was any difference. Lenin's brain was also, in fact, Dr. Robert White, who I talked about, who did the monkey head transplant, was invited to Moscow to look at Lenin's brain to see why he was so brilliant. Many would disagree with that, but anyway, he was invited to do that. So is there any evidence that you can find that the brain of a very smart man, like Einstein, is different from the brain of someone who's not quite so clever?
Well, maybe, but probably not with methods like that. Sort of studying the structure of brains, there's wide variation in normal people, or even genius normal people, not necessarily tight links between specific anatomical details and, cognition, IQ, etc.
Not the size of the brain, right? The size, or the details of how the gyri are formed, the sort of surface, or even the details of, in the end, Einstein's brain machinery is the same as anyone else's. Why was it the case that he was able to have these particularly creative insights? And, why are some people better at certain things than others? There's some link between the brain and that, in the sense that if you look across people who practice a similar skill or something like that, you may see an enhancement of the structures of the brain important for that. That relates to that neuroplasticity idea, potentially. But the kinds of things that Einstein was really good at are kind of defy our analysis, right? It's one thing to know about some basic motor skill or something where we have a pretty good idea of the circuitry involved. It's another thing to get to kind of creative genius and even know where to look. And I would be a bit surprised if you could see that on a autopsy result or another very similar question. Someone wants to know, can you comment on how ADHD changes the brain?
Well, it's a good question. It's a very common diagnosis these days. There's no doubt that there's a wide variation in the ability to really focus. That sort of attentional control is one of those really hard things the brain does, and that varies across the population. Whether there's kind of an end to that distribution that turns into what we would call like a disorder, I think we could debate. I don't know if you've ever done a session on DSM and things like that, but in any case, clearly there are people who are at an extreme of that distribution who really struggle with attention and related capacities of controlling responses, and who are helped in some cases by certain medications. It's still difficult to pin down what is the pathological basis of that. We know a lot about what are the different chemical constituents, what are the different circuits that are important to do those functions, but there's not, as far as I know, last time I checked, there's not a clear single explanation for so-called ADHD. I would be surprised if we found one, because I think personally it's probably a manifestation of the fact that these are the hard things the brain does. So if something's just not quite right in a whole variety of ways across all these possible mechanisms, then I would predict, especially in kids whose brains are still developing, that this is the area that's one of the more fragile. So there are probably many individual contributors to that syndrome as a whole.
We got another question here, which is very topical. Social connections are important for general health, but can you comment on how social media plays into that? Is it a good substitute for in-person connection? Is it ruining our brains?
I don't think it's ruining our brains. It depends what you mean by social media. I mean, obviously in-person interactions are richer and surely more engaging, and they're more what the brain is built for. There's a reason though that we prefer, I think, these kinds of Zoom interactions where we can at least see the person's face and some of their body language than just an audio. So we're engaging more of the brain when we have a few different sensory inputs. Social media, though, in the sense of Facebook or these kinds of other ways of interacting, I mean, inherently they're not ruining your brain, but they're not a replacement for in-person interaction. To the extent people have studied the sort of social networks and things like that, my understanding is that it's your real friends who matter, not your Facebook friends, in terms of the correlates of sort of richer social networks. And then, of course, the other problems with social media are that they provide you with all kinds of they really know how to engage your kind of relatively basic brain systems in terms of being surprised and then curious and then following up and distracted, shiny objects, interesting memes, whatever. And you can, of course, waste a lot of time, if nothing else. Does that ruin your brain? No, but it is an opportunity cost that maybe your brain might be better spent doing other things. Possibly.
Okay, we have a question here that I have pretty strong views on. Are there any supplements, health products, or specific foods we should be eating to help keep our brains healthy?
So, I mean, if I didn't have a conscience, I'd be saying yes and then selling them to you. There's, it would be great to have simple answers like that. The only robust evidence is that controlling your body weight is good for your brain. So whatever intake helps you keep your body weight in a relatively normal range is probably good. There's a little bit of evidence around Mediterranean diet being particularly a good one, which is like high in legumes, vegetables, low in meat. And there's some evidence from Scandinavian countries that if you eat a lot of oily fish, salmon, herring, sardines, and so on, there's correlational evidence that people who eat more of that kind of oily fish are less likely to have later life dementia. But the causal link is really not clear. It's quite difficult to study this, of course, to go from a correlation across a big population to a causal study for dementia, where you need to follow people for possibly decades. It's hard. And as far as I know, there's not really strong evidence for taking supplements like fish oils, or some of these have been studied specifically in patients with dementia, and they've not been shown to help, things like ginkgo biloba and so on. So mostly it's a good, it's great for marketing. It's not clear that supplements are useful. A balanced diet and a healthy weight. Sorry, I wish I had a pill for this.
P.G. Wodehouse, who wrote the classic Jeeves stories, again, one of my heroes, Bertie Wooster was Jeeves's employer. Whenever he had to get out of a jam, which Jeeves always helped him get out of, he would always urge him to go and eat his sardines. Anyway, as far as the supplements go, as I was saying earlier, this is one of my pet peeves, because there's no day that goes by that I don't get 2 or 3 questions about some supplement. Can it make you smarter? And it's just mind-boggling how many different ones there are out there, although the most prevalent one is Prevagen. That's the one that I get questions about most, because they push this every night on CNN. They have 0 scientific evidence for this. This is one of the biggest scams going. And they charge a lot of money for this. And it obviously doesn't work, because people keep buying it and they don't get smart enough to realize that it isn't working. Okay. So,
I have some questions for you, Joe. I'm going to interrupt you because there's some questions here about your talk that I've been provided with.
Okay.
Where did Ouija boards come from?
Yeah, Ouija boards go back again to the heyday of spiritualism. It goes back to the Fox sisters, the middle 1800s. And it was just a way that you would communicate with the spirits. And it functions on something we call the ideomotor reaction, where people actually move things without realizing that they're the ones who are moving it. And of course, if you have a Ouija board and you mix up the letters or you blindfold the people, they cannot do the message. So it is very clear that they are using this ideomotor reflex to do that. But it's a fascinating phenomenon, but it has been well studied. And but it does not in any way show that you can communicate with the spirit world.
Some of the other questions I have here are actually maybe for both of us. So Is there any explanation for the white light people seem to see when they are dying? What
I
do you
haven't
think?
seen it yet, luckily, and I guess neither have you. But I mean, there are many reports of that. That's for sure. So there is something there to be investigated, but you know, not everything has a findable answer. I mean, there are many things in life that remain mysteries. I don't know. Do you have any
Well,
ideas?
I mean, sure. I mean, so neurons discharge. They normally discharge because they've received a signal and they're responding to an input. So neurons in your visual cortex, for example, are responding to light coming in, and you perceive it as light. But if you discharge those neurons for another reason, like if you activate them with transcranial stimulation, for example, the person will see flashing lights because you're activating the neurons, which normally are part of circuits that are normally seeing. So the person's phenomenological experience of that is that as though they're seeing lights, but it's just their cortex being physically activated. So it's possible that during some surge and drop in blood pressure that those neurons fire because the electrical gradients are triggered, and then the person might interpret it as a flash of light, I suppose.
Well, I know there's this researcher in Ontario, I forget which university, who developed what has been called the God helmet, where you wear this helmet and it's got electrodes all over the place. And I mean, this is not quackery. He's a serious researcher, and it's got the electrical magnets to generate current, and by triggering various different points on that helmet, he creates different illusions. So I guess it's exactly what you described. He's triggering the firing of those neurons. So, but it gets back to my Sherlock Holmes quote that just because, we can't totally explain it doesn't mean that we have to look at paranormal means. It just means that we don't yet have the total explanation.
So there's kind of a related question that maybe we could both tackle here, that when people see ghosts, what's actually going on? Is it in their brain? Is it a visual effect in the world, I guess?
I think they're sitting in the movies.
I mean, from some of the stuff you showed, it looked like sometimes they really were seeing real things out there.
They think that they are seeing, but who knows what they're seeing? They're seeing various reflections of light. It's not the kind of thing where you can set up a double-blind randomized trial, because these ghosts don't appear when you want them to appear, right? They appear mysteriously. I mean, but just because there are a lot of ghost stories, and certainly there are a lot of ghost stories, that doesn't mean that therefore ghosts exist. Repetition does not make something real, as Trump, of course, is a great example. So just because you say something over and over again doesn't mean that it's real.
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple of things from neurology that might be interesting in this regard. I mean, one is I'm sitting here where I'm looking at a window where I see my own reflection, but I know it's me, not a ghost, because I know that about how the world works, that you see reflections of yourself against dark windows. But people with dementia, especially Alzheimer's disease, actually, one of a pretty common symptom is that they interpret reflections of themselves in mirrors or windows as real and somebody else. They don't recognize themselves, and they don't recognize it as an illusion, to the point where it can be quite problematic. They can begin to believe that there are whole worlds existing on the other side of the window or the mirror, and they can be frightened or at least distracted by these other people in the house. So the ability to kind of interpret the sensory information, which does look like the person I'm looking at myself in the window, and understand what it means, is actually a pretty advanced brain function that breaks down in some dementias.
Well, most so-called ghost sightings are eventually explained as, floors sometimes creak. They just do, not because a ghost steps on them. And you have various kinds of reflections. You have eerie sounds in a house at night. But of course, just because most are explained does not rule out the possibility that some can be real, right? That's always the argument that these people have. And it's an argument that how can you fight that? Because we always say, that in science, you can't prove a negative. We cannot prove that ghosts do not exist. It's up to those who believe that they do exist to come up with the proof. So far, I haven't seen any. It's also interesting that, when people talk about these near-death experiences, they always see angels and blue light and nice light. No one ever sees flames. Everyone is going in the right direction. Okay.
Just so the ones who come back.
Yeah. So I think we had an interesting evening here, chatting about how the brain works and about the importance of exercising the brain. And I think we did that for you here tonight. We exercised your brain. But I said that there are no such things as ghosts, right? They don't appear. But let's see whether or not we can make one appear. All right, let's give this a try, because here's my ghostly cloth. And as you can see, there's nothing there. Now let's see. What do you know? There are ghosts. And if you believe that, you're not exercising your mind critically. So, Lesley, thanks very much for joining us here tonight. We had a lot of fun. And also let me remind the audience that the recording of tonight and also of last night will be available. Last night already is available. You go to youtube.com/McGill-OSS, or you can go to our website, which is mcgill.ca/OSS. And that's it for the 2021 version of the Lorne Trottier Public Science Symposium. We appreciate everyone who has helped put this together, particularly Ada, who did all of the advertising. And obviously, Lorne, who is the man who really made it all possible with his original donation to fund the symposium. So Lorne, thanks very much for doing that. And hopefully next year, we will be back live at the Centre Mont-Royal with hundreds of people cheering wildly. But anyway, we've done okay. Zoom works. And ghosts need not apply for how it works. All right, thanks all of you, and we will see you somewhere, hopefully in this world.